Hey Wargamers, welcome back to the channel, deathfromabove.wargaming.com. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Kevin.
And we're here to talk to you about classic BattleTech. So we're doing a little segment, a little series here on how to play the game, and this particular video is on the shooting phase.
Best phase.
Best phase, you love it. And so I think the first thing we're going to talk about is declaring your shots, right? So, I mean, really in the shooting phase, it's about who do you want to shoot, lining up your shot, right? So there's firing arcs. The weapons are mounted on the mech. Some of the weapons are mounted on their arms or on the torso. Some of them are rear facing. And depending on where the weapons are and depending on the direction that you're facing, you can only fire certain weapons at a given target. So mechs have a little bit of flexibility there because their arms can pivot, right? And they can also pivot at the waist, right? So they can do what's called a torso twist and bring their whole facing to change
Right,
an
shift
entire...
the firing arcs, essentially.
Exactly. So they can shift their firing arcs. Now there are 4 firing arcs. There's the forward firing arc, which is basically the front 3 hexes. There's a left side, a right side, and then the rear, right? And so by moving their arms, by torso twisting, they can bring different weapons to bear on their targets.
Right.
Yep.
So, I mean, like part of that decision making, whether or not you're going to torso twist, who you're going to declare against, is also based on what weapons you're bringing to the table, right? What is your mech mounted with?
Right.
And all your weapons are essentially going to have their own profile on your record sheet, where you're going to have things like a range bracketing, damage value, and a heat value. Damage and heat we'll discuss later, but essentially the range bracketing is going to help determine who you're declaring against and probably a lot of that strategic decision into what you're going to declare against based on the range. Typically you're declaring a primary target, or you have a primary target in mind. You can declare secondary targets and split your fire, but secondary targets do suffer a modifier that makes you decide whether or not it's a good thing to do based on the modifier at hand.
Right.
Shooting weapons that use and expend ammo, you're going to mark them off at this point. And on the sheet, there's going to be rounds indicated for every particular weapon. You're just going to check 1 round for every time you fire it, no matter how many bullets, missiles are in that particular salvo or shot.
Right. Yep. Yeah, and you know, it's important because if you're Kevin and you consistently hit somebody's ammo bin and you destroy them every time you pull the trigger, you're going to want to make sure you mark off your ammo, because that can actually be a life or death situation, right? Because if your ammo bins are empty and Kevin hits it, well, guess what? You didn't kill my mech this time, Kevin. So eat that. So basically, in the shooting phase, right, everybody's shooting at the same time, right? Bullets are flying at the same time, which makes the game fun.
So no excuses.
Right, there's no excuses, right? So if you declare your mech is shooting whether or not it's been destroyed or not, so the order in which you roll the dice to shoot really has no bearing. So this is a phase where really initiative does not come into play, because
and that's up to your gaming group. You know, we like to alternate teams or players depending on how many players are at the table, just to kind of let people get a break.
Right.
But essentially it doesn't matter, because if you declare, you get to shoot.
Yeah. I mean, I like to save the most suspenseful shots for the very end, right? Yeah. Get all the boring ones out of the way. Yeah, so what's next?
So, I mean, you really got to decide then whether or not that target is in line of sight. And if they are, really you can only declare against a target that is within a line of sight. But what also applies in line of sight is things like cover and what kind of modifiers you're going to suffer based on that cover. So we use our 3D models, the miniatures that are part of the game. I recommend everybody use them, buy your models, paint them up, bring them to the table. We like to measure line of sight from the target's eye, or from the model's eye view. So essentially measuring over the mech's cockpit, center torso area right above it, whether or not they can see the target, and also determining what bits of terrain or hills, forests, things like that are interdicting your line of sight.
Yep.
And then there's different modifiers that go with that, whether or not there's a forest in the way, or a particular building or some other obstruction that would block or obscure your line of sight.
Right. And we actually have laser pointers, laser line pointers, which you can get, which are another great tool to use to kind of determine, if that line of sight is blocked or partially.
Line of sight is serious business.
It's serious business. Many arguments have been had over line of sight, no doubt.
Lazy eye.
Old lazy eye, as my nickname goes. Kevin always seems to think that my mechs are not in cover, but I always think that they are. Pretty sure they're always in cover. They take their cover with them. Right. It's glued on the base. I mean, I think that counts.
Yeah.
So when you're shooting, though, gunnery skill is like the main thing, right? You're rolling dice, you have to roll them against something. And so gunnery skill is basically your core statistic. So we talked about piloting skill in the movement phase. Gunnery skill is the second main skill that the mech warriors have. And there's this thing in the book they talk about, it's called GATOR. And that's an acronym to help you remember how to calculate the number that you need to roll to equal or beat in order to determine a hit. And GATOR stands for, G is for gunnery, so that's your gunnery skill. So if your gunnery skill is 2, you start with a 2. The A and the T are for attacking or the attacker and the target modifier. So we covered these in the movement phase video. And the attacker mod is really how fast you moved or your movement mode. So if you walked, you ran, you jumped, right? That has a different number. And then the target mod, how far the guy you're shooting actually moved, right? So their distance will give them a certain modifier. So you start to add these things up, right? That number's getting higher. The O stands for other. So that's things like cover, whether you've taken certain damage to your sensors or your targeting apparatus or your actuators or whatever it might be. So that's going to penalize you a little bit more. And then R, you were talking a little bit about the range profile on weapons. So depending if that particular weapon is at short, medium, or long range, that adds a different number on. You add all those things up, you get a target number, you roll 2d6. If you meet it or beat it, boom, get a hit.
And another thing to call out too is you could have different target numbers for different weapons, and primarily around things like range, where 2 different weapons might have a different range profile. You could be firing one at, say, for example, a target number of 5 and another for a target number 6. So there's some easy things, the way to track that through your dice, but it's mostly memorization.
Yeah, and we do have, that's a good point, we do have that dice system that we use to kind of help simplify, especially for the attacker and target mods, right? We kind of put those right on the board so you can kind of do that math.
Right. And most importantly, roll them all at once, rather than rolling separately and trying to figure out whether or not each weapon hit. You'll be able to track all your weapon at once based on our coloring system.
Yep, that's a good point.
So, once everything you decide hits or does not hit, the things that hit, if you have missiles involved, both short range and long range missiles, you're going to have to go and look up against the cluster hits table. So, missiles get fired in a salvo. It's essentially a swarm of direct fire missiles. Well, in some cases indirect fire, but essentially they're not like homing missiles like your traditional,
modern technology. This is future technology, which sucks a lot more apparently.
So not all of your missiles going to hit. So you basically roll against a probability table to determine how many missiles in that cluster hit. At DFA, we kind of tried to simplify that. We don't really want to have to do a table lookup for every time we fire a missile, and it's hard to memorize. So we essentially use a simple dice system where every cluster gets a dice roll, and based on a 3 or a higher, that missile cluster is hitting, and we apply damage from there. But otherwise, once you determine which clusters are hitting, which weapons that are not missile weapons are hitting, you roll them against a hit location table.
Right.
So basically, similar to how you had firing arcs, all your targets are going to have a hit direction facing. So essentially, you could be hitting in their front facing, a side facing, or the rear facing, depending on your angle and line of sight to their target X.
Right.
And that's going to impact which the table essentially has different columns for front, rear, and the sides.
Yeah.
They're going to impact probability to hit a specific location. So if you're aiming for a certain sweet spot or a weak point, you definitely want to take advantage of that hit location table.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I guess we can show that in our next gameplay segment, which is coming up next. And then after that, we'll talk about taking damage. That's the next video. So stay tuned. More to come. Thanks from all of us here at DFA Wargaming. Cool.